Napoleon Bonaparte had been up for hours. Even before the first rays of sun touched the roofs of the Tuileries, the emperor was already running his empire, dictating orders right from his bed. This day will reveal how he spends every hour, what he eats, how he maintains himself, and the physical limitations faced by the man holding the fate of Europe. In the dimly lit bedroom, barely illuminated by the faint glow of two candles, the air was cool. A damp chill seeped in from the poorly closed window, mixed with the scent of ink and wax that hung in the air around his bedside table. Napoleon sat propped against the pillows, his pale face illuminated from below, casting sharp shadows. His eyes burned with a feverish glint, despite the early hour and his obvious exhaustion. Two secretaries worked in front of him, bent over papers, their quills scratched across the parchment, struggling to keep pace with the emperor's torrent of words. Stacks of reports, maps, and scribbled sheets piled up on the small table, creating a chaos in which Napoleon, it seemed, saw perfect order. He dictated an order for the purchase of thousands of pairs of boots for a new campaign, his voice hoarse from strain and lack of sleep, but he didn't allow himself to repeat a single word. The secretaries were accustomed to this pace. Their hands moved quickly and precisely, careful not to miss a single detail. The emperor, who governed a continent, personally delved into routine administrative work, controlling every minute detail from strategic plans to army boots. His fingers, resting on the blanket, involuntarily clenched as he pondered the next item. The scratch of one of the secretary's pens suddenly stopped. He froze for a moment. Napoleon looked up, and the secretary, paling, immediately resumed writing, understanding that delays were unacceptable. This day would show how the empire rested on his personal energy, on his ability to digest mountains of paperwork and make decisions, all while Europe awaited his downfall. After hours of working in bed, Napoleon finally got up. Servants, already waiting at the door, entered the bedroom without disturbing the silence. One of them brought a pewter basin with ice-cold water and a coarse towel. The emperor disliked long ceremonies. He quickly washed, vigorously rubbing his face and neck to shake off the last traces of sleep. The steam from his breath mingled with the cold air, creating a faint mist. He preferred ice-cold water, believing it was more invigorating. Another servant helped him dress. Napoleon chose a simple green uniform of the Imperial Guard, without excessive ornamentation. The scent of damp wool and the faint aroma of cologne, which the servant lightly dabbed on his neck, filled the room. He didn't waste time on luxurious attire, preferring practicality and symbolism instead. The uniform fit snugly. Its stiff fabric slightly restricted his movements, but this was familiar. His morning meal was just as Spartan. On a simple wooden tray, the servant brought a thin slice of bread and a glass of lemon water. Napoleon ate quickly, barely looking at his food, his mind already occupied with the day's tasks. He disliked elaborate breakfasts, considering them a waste of time. A stiff toothbrush, which he used after eating, concluded his hygiene ritual. He thought about the day ahead, about the endless reports and orders he needed to sign. Every minute counted, and personal discipline was the foundation of his power. He felt a slight pressure in his temples from lack of sleep, but he ignored it. Even in the smallest details, his morning was a preparation for battle, a battle where every minute counted, and personal discipline was the very foundation of his power. Napoleon had just finished his meager breakfast when an adjutant entered the room, holding a crumpled parchment report in his hands. The courier's face was pale and his hands trembled, betraying the urgency and unpleasantness of the news. The cold air in the study, despite the roaring fire in the fireplace, felt even more chilling. The adjutant handed over the report. Napoleon unrolled it, his heavy gaze scanning the lines. It spoke of mass desertions in the newly formed regiments and critical delays in food and uniform supplies from the Rhineland. It was a blow. He gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Beneath his skin, anger pulsed. In the quiet of the room, broken only by the scratch of his secretary's pen, Napoleon felt the fragile grip he had on power. The spring campaign plan, which he had so carefully constructed, now hung by a thread. This news didn't just change his daily routine. It jeopardized the very existence of his army and his empire. He pictured the faces of the deserters, imagining their weariness and their fear. He knew the supply delays meant hunger and cold for soldiers who hadn't yet grown accustomed to the new conditions. By the end of the day, he had to find a solution that would keep the empire from collapsing. If he failed, he would face a new coalition with no army to oppose it. The cost of failure was immense, meaning the loss of power and everything he had built over the years. The thought tormented him that every hour of delay brought disaster closer. He had to act, and act immediately. Napoleon strode quickly through the corridors of the Tuileries to his main study. His adjutants, their faces a mix of weariness and apprehension, struggled to keep pace with him. His footsteps echoed on the cold stone floors, mingling with the scent of dampness and old wood that permeated the palace walls. The dim light from the tall windows barely lit his way, making shadows dance on the walls. He noticed the weary faces of the guards on duty. Though clean, their uniforms looked faded. Dust on the carpets, maps carelessly propped against the wall. These small details all spoke to the palpable tension permeating the palace. His boots slipped on the polished stone, a sensation that brought back memories of the muddy Russian roads, the endless marches, and the bitter cold. The weight of his uniform tight against his body bore down on his shoulders. Around one of the corridor's turns, he saw a group of disabled veterans. These former soldiers, their faces gaunt and clothes worn, were now begging for alms at the palace gates. Their empty gazes followed him, a silent reproach, reminding him of the true cost of his ambitions. One of them let out a dry cough, which cut sharply through the silence, almost like a challenge. Napoleon didn't slow his pace, but his gaze lingered on them for a fraction of a second. He felt a pang of discomfort seeing these faces, these living reminders of loss. Servants passing by tried not to look at the disabled veterans, quickening their pace. Each step Napoleon took within this palace, within this city, reminded him of the price of his ambitions and how fragile the balance was between glory and oblivion. In his study, Napoleon was deep into hours of intense work. He sat at a massive desk, piled high with stacks of signed papers, scattered maps, and inkwells. His thin lips were pressed tightly together, and his pale face showed intense concentration. He switched between military, financial, and civil matters with incredible speed, his mind working like a flawless machine. He read reports, dictated letters, and signed decrees. Ink stains on his fingers were a familiar sight. The creak of his chair occasionally interrupted the quiet where his secretaries worked. Their eyes, weary from constant strain, followed his every move. He felt a throbbing pain in his temples from lack of sleep, but he only rubbed them absently, never pausing his work. At one point, while signing another conscription order, his hand involuntarily twitched. A sharp pain shot through his wrist from hours of writing. He froze for a moment, but immediately continued without showing it. It was just a minor stumble, yet it offered a glimpse of the human being behind the mask of the unwavering emperor. He thought about how his decisions affected thousands of lives, but these thoughts were merely a backdrop to his main task of managing the empire. Behind the mask of the unwavering emperor was a man whose body and mind were wearing down under the weight of the empire. Napoleon's intense work was interrupted. An adjutant burst into the office, his face tense, holding a new report. The silence before a storm hung heavy in the air. The news he brought was shocking. Prussia, a nominal ally of France, had begun secret negotiations with Russia to form a new coalition. This was more than just a threat. It was a betrayal demanding an immediate and decisive response. Napoleon abruptly pushed his chair back, sending it crashing to the floor, the sound echoing through the study. His face contorted with rage, and a cold glint appeared in his eyes. He crumpled the report in his fist, feeling a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The adjutant, his face tense, stood motionless, awaiting the emperor's reaction. Napoleon's previous plan was crumbling. He felt control slipping from his grasp. This betrayal was depriving him not only of an ally, but also of valuable time he had planned to use for rebuilding his army. He felt the fatigue, accumulated over long hours of work, now intensifying with anger and frustration. His usual daily routine was broken. He was losing the rest his exhausted body so desperately needed. Now, he faced not only gathering an army, but also preventing the complete encirclement of France, making a crucial choice between diplomacy and a new war. This choice felt both political and deeply personal, a physical burden. He understood that every decision he made would have immense consequences. After the news of Prussia's betrayal, Napoleon secluded himself in his library. The dim light that filled the room, along with the scent of old books and dust, seemed to calm his agitated mind. He paced between the tall shelves, his footsteps creaking on the parquet floor. The reflection of a candle in the glass of a bookcase danced on the walls, creating strange shadows. His thoughts returned to past victories and defeats. He recalled Josephine's words about his star, about how luck would always be on his side. He ran a finger along the spine of an old book about Hannibal, feeling the dust of ages. The great Carthaginian who dared to challenge Rome by crossing the Alps with his army. Napoleon saw in him a kindred spirit, a man who wasn't afraid to go against the current. He thought about his family, about the dynasty he had worked so hard to build, his son, whom he saw so rarely. All of this was part of his legacy, something he couldn't allow to be destroyed. He understood that retreat was not an option. Retreat would mean disgrace, the loss of everything he had conquered. He felt his body, worn out by lack of sleep and stress, crying out for rest. But his mind refused to yield. His focused gaze drifted over the spines of books, but he didn't see their titles. Instead, he saw battle maps, the faces of his marshals, and thousands of soldiers awaiting his commands. The decision was made. The only path forward was to advance, even if it meant a new war against all of Europe, against anyone who dared to challenge him. He was ready to risk everything to reclaim his lost glory, knowing the cost could be immense, but he would not retreat. That evening, a reception brought together several ministers and marshals in one of the Tuileries palace halls. The dim light of the candelabras barely illuminated the faces of those present, casting long shadows. The smell of roasted meat and wine filled the air, but a palpable unease lingered over the table. Napoleon's orders for mobilization and preparation for a new campaign had already been dispatched, and their impact was evident in every glance, in every gesture. The attendees were cautious. Some ministers avoided the emperor's direct gaze, their eyes wandering across the walls as if searching for an escape. Others, in contrast, were overly zealous, trying to demonstrate their loyalty and readiness for action. The clinking of cutlery seemed too loud in this tense atmosphere. Napoleon barely touched his food, only mechanically breaking off a piece of bread. His face looked gaunt, and his movements were slow. His tired eyes betrayed a sleepless night and a difficult day. He noticed one of the marshals, usually lively and talkative, barely touch his wine, his gaze wandering and revealing deep thought or apprehension. The creak of the parquet floor under the servants' feet as they served dishes was the only constant sound. The day was over, but its consequences were only just beginning to manifest, leaving the first subtle cracks in his demeanor, foreshadowing the trials to come. Napoleon wasn't sleeping. He stood by a slightly open window, looking out at a sleeping Paris. The darkness outside was broken only by a few distant lights, flickering in the distance. Cold air from the window brushed his face, carrying the distant bark of a dog that broke the night's silence. This day wasn't just another ordinary day. It was a turning point when he definitively chose the path of war, a path that would determine the fate of millions. He felt weary, but his mind kept working, weighing options and calculating risks. Deep sleep wouldn't come. He touched his old campaign coat hanging on a chair. The rough fabric, which had seen so many victories, now foreshadowed new trials. He thought of those who had died in Russia, of those who had deserted, and of those now preparing for a new campaign. The repercussions of this day would reach far beyond his own lifetime. Decisions made today would impact the fate of France, reshape the balance of power in Europe, and profoundly affect the lives of ordinary people called to serve. He knew his name would echo through the ages, but what kind of legacy would it carry? Would it be that of a conqueror or a tyrant? He didn't know. He stood, listening to the silence that pressed in on his ears. The sound of a distant bell, drifting from somewhere deep within the city, reminded him of the relentless passage of time. He knew that tomorrow would bring a new day full of new challenges. He was ready.